All right, this is the second video about the studio when you're talking about signal flow. This video, I'll try to keep this basic. The investigation is going to kind of have to be on your part, but the basic understanding of it, if you've got a pretty good understanding of what you want your signal flow to be, and you've investigated most of the processors that can be used in the studio, and anything that you might want to put in your studio, and have made a decision on what you want to use, and you've got a pretty good understanding of your signal flow, one of the things that is going to be very pertinent in that process of establishing your signal flow is what those processors are doing. Very simply, sorry for the small picture on this, but I blowed it up and it was one I had, and it doesn't look very good blowed up. But anyway, the understanding of it is the circuitry. Two things. The first thing is, when you're looking at it, any of your equipment, that any of the inputs and outputs that are going to be on the pieces of equipment, no matter if it's from your mixing console to your computer to your interface to any effect that you might have, to really investigate what is going on with the inputs and outputs of that piece of equipment. And it's not going to hurt you to dig around a little bit and investigate that, and pick the basic equipment and or complex equipment that basically they do the same thing. A mixing board is a mixing board, and some of them will do different things for more complex situations and more complex mixing signal flows. But if you get a good understanding and you download some and you get some schematics for them about what they are, and ask some real simple questions on the internet about what does what is that, that tape input, what is that, XLR input, what is that, and don't get wrapped up in a bunch of don't get wrapped up in a bunch of Bill or Bob's viewpoint of it. What does it do? What exactly does it do? And stick with that to understand the basics of what you're looking at, so you've got a good solid foundation of what those ins and outs are. And that goes with any effects processor, or any effects or any processors that can be in your signal flow path, and investigate them very well. If you take and look at almost all basic processors and effects and find one to investigate, that it'll give you a pretty good understanding of all of them. For the most part, you can run into some oddities or some specialties and things like that, but if you have a basic understanding, that you should have a pretty good understanding of how they're going to connect. Patch bays, things that can connect other things together, different types of cords, anything like that, anything that can possibly be in the signal flow, and really investigate that aspect of each one of those processors and effects and equipment. And you'll be surprised that you'll probably get a handle on it pretty quickly if you just spend some time doing that. And the next thing is that circuits are really cool, because not only if you can get some circuits to understand, let's say this is a mixing console, and you've seen the other one that I had that's for the actual studio, that's showing you the actual signal flow in the studio, which broken down is exactly, you're looking at the signal flow through the mixing console as a separate entity, and as you go through that each one of them you can break down to a separate entity. This is the mixing console. Not only have you investigated it from the outside of the piece of equipment, what the ins and outs are, but also from the inside. What is the signal flow inside of it? Where is it going? Why it's traveling off here and there? And what is that doing? That doesn't mean you need to become a full-fledged audio engineer, and go to school, for I don't know how long to understand that. But basic understanding of what those processors are in there, and what those things are in the circuitry, from the hardware perspective, and also taking a piece of software and trying to get schematics of the software to where you're looking at basically a circuit for a software a compressor or tremolo effect that's basically circuit in a code form, and really look at the signal flow of what's going on, where it goes in, where it comes out, what's happening to it, to really get an understanding of your signal flow. And you can do that with all of them, so that if you have any pieces of hardware that are EQs, where it's coming in, where it's going out, where it's going, where the signal flow is going. And, you know, along that line, you are most definitely going to pick up some understanding of circuitry and some understanding of the code, so that you have a better understanding what happens when it comes in, what happens when it comes out, to give you a much better understanding of what's happening there. And that's the same thing with just about any of them. With a limiter, with limiters, compressors, you know, if you have compressors, tremolo effects, which is basically any type of effect you may be using, hardware or software, that you might be putting inside there. Microphone preamps, anything like that, that you have to excuse me about the small pictures, but you get the general idea. That basically that is going to help you immensely from looking at it from both of those perspectives and seeing it from both of those angles, from the outside of the piece of hardware and from the inside of the piece of hardware, as you're working on your signal flow and as you're understanding your signal flow, that by the time you get done with that piece of hardware and understanding anything that can be put into it or anything that can come out of it, that, you know, you will start to, as you start to look at each one of those processors and effects that way and that kind of detail, that you will probably, I'd say most definitely, by the time you get done doing your research, that you should have a pretty good understanding of the signal flow. And when you look at some complex signal flow, that as long as you understand what that piece of equipment is, and then you've already more than likely understand what it's doing, and it might route differently. The actual inside of it might function differently than another one, and you get a schematic and understand what's happening inside of it. And you're not just looking at the outside of it. Once you understand that, you actually understand what's going on inside of it, so you have an in-depth understanding of the signal flow in your studio. And as you progress along that, and you'll have to excuse me because this video is very basic along those lines, because, you know, for me to go into every one of them, you know, Bill, Bob, Tim, Jimmy, and Tom all like these different compressors or this different thing because it does that, or it sounds like this, or it sounds like that. And most of that if you've watched all the videos on this channel, you understand what the difference is on there. It normally breaks down to analog issues that are why they use them. And, you know, to understand those issues, once you understand that, when you get inside of it, that you understand that those things might be doing those things a little bit differently, and understanding maybe what's happening in that processor and why that processor might be doing it differently, and what the components are inside of it, between one mixer or another, even down to real simple things like crossbleed, you know, and crosstalk inside of a mixing console. That those kind of issues can be very important, you know, if you're deciding to go with those pieces of hardware equipment and you haven't just gone completely inside of the DAW to where you're not having to deal with any of that kind of stuff. Or you have to in a larger environment just to do what you want to do, because it's not possible to do it that way, which it is now, but, you know, that's coming very rapidly. And so I wanted to address that very basically and very simply, so that as you're working on your signal flow in your studio, that, you know, once you've decided that what your signal flow is possibly going to be, from making a decision of how complex it's going to be, and then going back to those individual processors and looking at them from the outside and from the inside to really understand what's happening to the signal flow. And that goes for wireless systems, if you're using any of those, to understand those from the same perspective, and any type of cords, what's happening with different cords. Why is this cord better? Why do you use that? Why do you not want a longer cord? Why do you want a shorter cord? I mean, those kind of aspects in your signal flow, as you investigate that and ask very direct questions. Don't get caught up in Bob likes this or Bill likes that. You know, you want to understand what it does and why it does that. And, and if it does it a little bit differently, that, then investigate that a little bit more, but understand the basics first, because you can get wrapped up in that till doomsday, and you'll find that a lot of that stuff you run into, that's going to boil down to that you can fix that problem with working with saturation that I've showed you in these videos, and working with noise to try to emulate or to try to change the sound of anything that you might be processing. Because most of the processors, until you get real specific into processors, like you might have some thing that emulates, some type of a Leslie rotor, and it's like, well, that's, an effect that can be, you really want that effect because there isn't anything else that does that, and it's like, I can understand that. But basic processors and basic things like mic preamps and, all that kind of stuff, that stuff normally is pretty basically the same type of equipment. Some of them do it a little bit differently, and they got different types of knobs, but to look inside of them, but to understand the basic process, what's happening, so you can understand the signal flow. What are all those plugins on the back of it? And it won't take you long just to look at them and get on the internet and look at them and ask very direct questions about what that is, exactly what that does. And as you understand that, you will start to understand why they got all this routing going on all over the place. Like, you've seen in that picture of the guy that, the guitar guy, that he's got this stuff routed everywhere. And as you start to understand each one of those processors and, the inside of them and the outside of them and the signal flow therein, that you will start to understand this kind of stuff will start to make a lot more sense to you as you're working in the studio, and how that stuff's going together and why you might want to do that. And, that sometimes it's can be a very basic way for you to go about working through that, instead of studying everything about it and just getting lost in it, which you can. And, it's like, I'm trying to keep you from watching 1,000 videos about, what's going on with that, to address it as simply as possible. And as you understand the simple understandings of it, that then you can start building complexities from the simplicities. Does that make sense? And I hope that really sinks in and you can understand that. So basically, that is my suggestion that you do, and that's basically the next part of understanding the signal flow, because we had talked about very simple things about, even things like this, that it's going off this effects device, going out and coming back in, and here's the input going to the output, and what's happening there, that's a part of the signal flow between two different processors. So you've got this here, and you've got this whole thing, the same thing that you're looking at from this other effects device. And as you look at those things, really understanding the signal flow, what's happening to it as it goes through those processors, then it's going to give you a really good understanding of your signal flow and why you might want to use those and why you don't want to use those, and where you might want to and where you don't want to use those, and even if you want to, just so that you don't go out and buy a bunch of stuff that you really don't need. Once you understand what it's doing, that you're like, why would I do that? I can do that in my DAW, or I can do that here. I can do that in line. I don't need that piece of equipment because I know I can do that here, rather than getting lost and, I need to have all this stuff going every which way but sideways, and then getting lost in that. So I hope I made that real simple. Like I said, I tried to make this real clear and real simple so that you can go investigate this with clear questions and clear, precise directions as you move through this for your signal flow, so that you don't waste a lot of time. And as you go through it, that you take these steps of understanding those things, so that you really have a good, solid, concrete understanding of what's happening there, so that your signal flow is well put together in the studio, and it's well thought through and put together precisely for precise reasons, rather than, you bought a bunch of stuff that you're not really sure what the heck even does, and your signal flow really doesn't have any foundation of a concrete foundation. So I hope that helps, and I hope that gives you some clear direction. Peace, hope, love.